It's been very interesting to us. Our filmmaking is a whole lot more about prayer than it is finding out about the fads or what's cool or what kind of movie is going to make a lot of money. None of those things are making our decisions for us. Fireproof was months and months of prayer, and God, we wanted to make a movie about some of these things over here, and God specifically was gearing us and directing us to make a movie about marriage. And then we begin to see that there were hundreds of marriage ministries ramping up to launch a marriage movement in 2008, and they were already in sync praying for a way to launch that marriage movement. And God used Fireproof to help make that happen. And we were discovering that we were becoming a part of something that was way bigger than ourselves because the Lord wants us to tune into His voice and be obedient and trust Him with the consequences. And God has got the bigger picture in mind. He's painting the tapestry of our lives to bring glory to Himself among the nations, to reveal to people who He is and how they can have a relationship with Him. And so with this movie, after Fireproof, everything the Lord has done with that, the Fireproof's in 75 countries on DVD right now. And with every movie, God has done more than we can ask or imagine. We got to the point where we began to just pray that as we would pray through things, because His visions are a lot bigger and His ideas are a lot bigger. So we would just say, Lord, as we're approaching acting and casting, would you just do more than we can ask or imagine? Because I can imagine a lot, but He can do so much more than that. And so, but with every movie, our box has gotten bigger because God keeps communicating to us there's no limitations to Him. He can do anything He wants to. If it's going to please Him and honor Him. And so you'll hear Alex say this, you'll hear me say this a lot. The blessing of the Lord is our greatest asset. If God chooses to place His hand of blessing on something, then He will open the doors. He'll send the money to pay for something. He'll provide the people. He will inspire the footage. He'll impact people's lives as they watch the film. It'll have a lasting impact on their lives. We haven't been to film school. I've never been on a Hollywood set. Haven't been trained in any of these things. God has called us to do this, we believe, and He keeps confirming that He's calling us to do this. And so we're not good enough and smart enough and have enough money to be able to pull these things off on our own ability. With every movie, we see God calling us to something, but it's way beyond what our ability is. And so it's very exciting for our church because we have to pray about the gap, and we see the Lord filling in the gap in front of us. And so we tell people it's like laying tracks in front of a moving train. We're being obedient to the Lord, but we don't have it all figured out. And we're watching God, again, continue to do more than we can ask or imagine. With Courageous, God was leading our hearts towards focusing in on the issue of fatherhood. And there are multiple factors that had to deal with that. One, Alex and I are very passionate about fatherhood because our dad broke the chain in our lives, in our family. He had been passed on a legacy of unfaithfulness and alcoholism, and our dad grew up in a home where he was afraid, insecure, very poor because his father was living for himself. And our dad tells us he didn't learn to swim until he was in college. There was a lot of things that dad should have been there with him in his life. He said it was very afraid as a child. And the security and the encouragement that a father should bring in his child's life, he didn't have that like he should have. And so, but our dad forgave his father. And that is a key factor in breaking that chain. And he began to seek the Lord in His Word, and he saw God as his Heavenly Father, and he was learning about God's love for him. And he had a godly praying mom too. But our dad then said, the buck stops here. He says, I'm going to pass on a legacy to my sons of faithfulness towards God, of faithfulness towards my wife. I want them to know the love of their earthly father, and I want to be there for them. And so he was getting anything he could, reading James Dobson books, that were coming out about parenthood, because that was when Focus on the Family was just getting started. He was doing whatever he could to try to figure out how to be a good dad because he wasn't given that example as much as he should have by his father. So we grew up in a home constantly being affirmed and prayed over and loved and trained and taught and disciplined and all those things by our earthly father. And he's still a hero for us in our lives. You can see a strong father character in all the movies. In Flywheel, there's a blessing scene where Jay Austen's dad comes in and lays his hands on his son and blesses him like the Old Testament patriarchs did. And our dad wrote that blessing scene for that movie. And in that scene, Roger Breland, who's in that scene, he's holding a cane because our dad was walking with a cane with multiple sclerosis at that time of our lives. When we were shooting Facing the Giants, our dad was in a wheelchair at that time. And so the father that was in the wheelchair who wanted to pull up on the fence and raise his arms and said, "Don't touch me, I'm standing for my son." That was completely patterned after our father, because that's the way he's lived his life for us. Supporting us and praying over us. You know, we don't call him as adults and ask his permission for things, but we respect his counsel though. And we still feel endeared to him. And so we tell people, even though he physically can't stand, he's standing for us in prayer every day. And it's made a big impact on our lives. And then in Fireproof, you know, the stronger mentor father, his adult son is struggling, and the father's just loving on him and faithful and prayerful. And so that's something we're passionate about. Secondly, you see it in our culture all the time, that the father figures portrayed in television and movies are very weak. They're usually perverted. They're the butt of the jokes. They're dominated by their wives and their kids that are smarter than they are. And they're the Homer Simpsons, you know, is the example now of fatherhood for this generation. Now, our grandparents' generation, remember, it used to be, or our parents' generation, it used to be Father Knows Best and Andy Griffith, and, you know, there were these strong father figures in the homes. And they weren't guys who were convoluted and twisted, where they were faithful. You know, I mean, you imagine Ward and June Cleaver. You know, him messing around on June. You know, there was some consistency in the value system. You know, that was being communicated. But that generation of children grew up seeing a good model for fatherhood to a certain degree in those television shows and in the movies. Nowadays, it's very rare. You very rarely at all ever see that. I think about the Cosby Show, you know, back in the 80s. He was presented in a positive light. But we would love to show this generation a picture of what fatherhood could be and should be. And so in Courageous, you follow the stories of 4 different sheriff's deputies and then also a Hispanic man. And you're following a Hispanic couple, and Javier and Carmen. He's just trying to make ends meet for his family. He is a man of faith, but his journey in the movie is a journey of providing for his family, which is a father should embrace that responsibility. You follow Nathan Hayes, African-American sheriff's deputy, and his wife. And in his fatherhood journey you see in the movie is, he makes the statement, "I'm 37 years old, I've never known my biological father. He walked out on us before I knew what was going on." And there's some bitterness and resentment there. And but he's trying to learn and figure out how to be a dad as he's interacting with his family. And he learns that he's losing the heart of his daughter. And so he's trying to win her heart back. And that's a key thing on being a successful dad. If a dad wants to win the ear of their children, they have to have their hearts. The last verse in the Old Testament says it's God's desire to turn the hearts of fathers to their children and children back to their fathers. Solomon said in Proverbs, he said, "My son, give me your heart and listen to the teaching of my lips." And we want dads to win the hearts of their kids and cherish that. They've been entrusted with that by God. And then to help set up their children for success. We're also learning that a child's identity is often connected to what his father says or does not say about them. In the Old Testament, Adam, if you remember, the first responsibilities God gave him was to name the animals, to help establish their identity. Naming Eve. And the men would speak to their sons, sometimes change their names to help them reestablish their identity. Jesus, when he was blessed by his heavenly Father, what did he hear at his baptism? "You are my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased." There's identity there. You're loved and you're my son. You're not only loved, but that's part of your identity. You are my beloved. It's part of who you are. You're agape love with unconditional love by your Father. And I'm pleased with you. All of us longed for that as children, to hear that from our earthly Father. I love you and I'm proud of you. I don't know how many times I hear adults say, "I've never heard my dad tell me he loved me." Or I never could measure up to my dad. I always tried to measure up to please him, and it was like I never could. So there's a big difference between a child who lives for the blessing of his father, because if he doesn't get it, he'll grow up and you'll see these men running the rat race. It's like it's never enough. They're always trying to win somebody's approval somewhere. Somebody please love me.